Once upon a time in a faraway land, there lived a beautiful princess who had been cursed by an evil witch to sleep for 100 years until a handsome prince came and kissed her. And they all lived happily ever after. Okay, yeah, we've heard that story before, right? But did you know that this classic fairy tale is actually based on a horrifying folk tale about cannibalism and murder? The tale of Snow White, Little Red Riding Hood, and Hansel and Gretel are also based on scary folk stories with even more gruesome origins than the story of Sleeping Beauty. The author of that tale, Charles Perrault, was actually famous for writing down traditional French folk tales, which means that Sleeping Beauty has been around in some form since at least the Middle Ages. In fact, there's a much older story from the 13th century called Sun, Snow, and Rose, which is basically the same as Sleeping Beauty, but with way more blood and guts. It tells the story of a king and queen who hear that a child has been born in a neighboring kingdom who is so beautiful that she puts their daughter to shame. So they make a plan to get rid of her. They lock her away in a tower with 7 poisonous snakes instead of 7 dwarfs, and then they visit her every day to see how she's doing. Yeah, that's definitely not what we're used to hearing. And if you thought that was crazy, wait till you hear about the next story, Little Red Riding Hood. This one might surprise you because most of us grew up with the Disney version where a girl wearing a red hood gets lost in the woods and is saved from a big bad wolf by a woodcutter. But the original version of Little Red Riding Hood is way darker than that. It comes to us from a collection of stories called The Book of Simple and Sincere Tales, and it begins like the Disney version with a young girl wearing a red hood who goes to visit her grandmother. But when she gets to the house, she opens the door and sees that the wolf has already eaten her grandmother and is lying in her bed pretending to be her. So Little Red Riding Hood is like, "Hey, Grandma, what big eyes you have." And the wolf is like, "All the better to eat you with, my dear." And then he jumps out of bed and eats her too. Yikes, but it gets even worse. In some versions of the story, the wolf actually takes Little Red Riding Hood back to his cave and lets his mama and Papa Wolf take turns eating her. Like, seriously, this story was written as an extended metaphor for the dangers of sexual assault. And that's why it's so weird that we tell it to little kids, Hansel and Gretel. We all know the story of these 2 siblings who run away into the forest and stumble upon a house made of candy. But in the original version of the tale, things don't end quite so happily ever after. In fact, it's kind of messed up. The story was published in 1812 in a collection of German fairy tales called Children, Is and Household Tales by the Brothers Grimm. And it begins with a poor family who have 2 children, Hansel and Gretel. When the kids are nearing starvation, their father takes them out into the forest to abandon them. He leaves them alone and tells them to stay put while he goes to look for food. But he never comes back, and Hansel and Gretel are forced to fend for themselves. Yep, you heard that right. The delicious treats were just a clever way to trick the kids into gaining weight so the witch could chow down on them. So now you know what those delicious snacks were really hiding. These stories are pretty messed up, but they're just the tip of the iceberg. Believe it or not, there are plenty more fairy tales that have origins that are just as dark and twisted. Let's take a look at a few more and see how these beloved stories really got their start. Cinderella. Most of us grew up watching the Disney version of Cinderella, where a young woman who's forced to live as a servant by her evil stepmother and stepsisters attends the emperor's ball in a beautiful gown and loses one of her glass slippers while escaping. But the version of Cinderella that we know and love today is actually a far cry from the original story. The earliest known version of the Cinderella story comes to us from ancient China. In this tale, Cinderella attends the emperor's ball in elaborate garments and loses one of her golden rings while escaping. Unlike the Disney version, there's no talk of pumpkins or mice or a fairy godmother. Instead, Cinderella's servants help her get ready for the ball, and her jade ring is lost while she's climbing over a wall to escape the emperor's unwanted advances. Talk about a very different kind of happily ever after. Snow White. You probably know the story of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs pretty well. A beautiful young woman is pursued by an evil queen who is jealous of her beauty. To escape the queen's wrath, Snow White runs away and hides in the forest, where she eventually comes across a small cottage belonging to 7 dwarfs. But the queen, who has been searching for Snow White, finds her and tricks her into eating a poisoned apple that puts her into a death-like sleep. Snow White is then placed in a glass coffin and taken to the dwarf's cottage, where she lies in wait for a handsome prince to wake her with a kiss. Yeah, but did you know that this beloved fairy tale actually has its roots in a terrifying legend about a real-life queen named Margaret von Waldeck? According to legend, Margaret was so beautiful that her stepdaughter, Countess Matilda, became insanely jealous. Consumed by envy, Matilda tricked Margaret into drinking a potion that turned her skin as white as snow, her lips as red as blood, and her hair as black as ebony. But the potion didn't kill Margaret, and she ended up fleeing to the nearby woods where she died of exhaustion. Her body was then placed in a hollow tree and covered with moss, which eventually grew over it, turning it into a tomb. And that is the real-life inspiration behind the story of Snow White. Rumpelstiltskin. Remember the story of Rumpelstiltskin, the little man who spun straw into gold? Well, it turns out that this classic fairy tale has been around since at least the Middle Ages. In fact, there are hundreds of variants of the Rumpelstiltskin story from all over Europe, each with its own unique twist. In most versions, a young woman is given a task by a king to spin straw into gold, and she is only able to do it with the help of a magical creature like a dwarf or a goblin who demands something from her in exchange for his help. Usually it's a ring or a necklace, but sometimes it's something much more valuable, like the firstborn child. The name Rumpelstiltskin itself is thought to derive from a German word that means stumpy little fellow, and the character is often depicted as being short and hunchbacked. But despite his rather unappealing appearance, Rumpelstiltskin is usually portrayed as being incredibly powerful and knowledgeable, capable of spinning straw into gold with just a flick of his magic wand. And of course, he always makes a deal with the unsuspecting hero, only to try and trick them out of their prize at the last minute. As you can see, many of our favorite fairy tales have surprisingly dark and violent origins. From cannibalism to murder, these stories were originally meant to teach children about the dangers of the world around them. But thankfully, over time, they've been cleaned up and adapted for younger audiences. What do you think? Are you surprised by the dark origins of these fairy tales? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want to learn more about the history of fairy tales, check out my other videos. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.